This is the aspect of your identity which becomes clearest when you say, I sincerely feel that I must do this, or I do this because I feel that this is true. It's the part of yourself which is immediately associated with immediate action and is associated with three kinds of emotion. One of the types of emotion immediately characteristic of the infantile ego is simple infantile elation at object possession. And object possession to the ego includes possession of people. That is, the elation that a child feels in having its mother, its wife, its girlfriend around is simple elation of object possession. There's nothing very human about it. The second of these emotions is the emotion of infantile anger or rage. And this type of emotion is what you are seeing manifest in the work of logicians and mathematicians and so forth. The essential emotion of mathematics is infantile rage. And that is no exaggeration. As a matter of fact, this becomes clearest in chess play, where there's a similar relationship. Across-the-board chess play involves an emotion. The emotion is pure infantile rage. There is no human relationship between the opponents across the chessboard. The third emotion associated with the ego is infantile sense of fear or depression. And these three emotions are associated with the ego. Now there's another entity, a second entity to consider, which you can experience by, and Hegel describes this somewhat in the introduction and preface to the Phenomenology of Mind, but it's something you can get at very easily, that you can, in a sense, be conscious of what you are thinking. You can be conscious of the mechanisms or certain of the dynamics involved in understanding why you feel certain things. Rather than simply feeling something, you can be conscious that this feeling is generated in you in a certain way. You can, in a sense, come up behind your own back, the back of your mind, and see what you are thinking, see how you are operating. This is self-consciousness. Now, self-consciousness, which in an adult society, which capitalist society is not, that is, in which human beings became adults and outgrew the infantile ego, the location of the sense of identity would be entirely located in this self-conscious self, which you can know empirically as that part of you which is able to look at what the other part of you is doing. In capitalist culture, in alienation, the self-conscious self is a rather weak creature emotionally. It generally does not know any emotions. It's simply a passive creature which is tolerated and utilized like a slave by the ego. It's used for thinking. Give an example. Some of you were exposed to a hideous experience which is called secondary school geometry. And in the U.S., that is a hideous experience. The pedagogy in the U.S. is, well, I'll get to that later when I discuss a German medical examination, which is one of the most hideous things that can be done to a human being. But in U.S. geometry, you're drilled in the following way. You're given a theorem or a problem, and the first thing you have to do is to develop a solution concept for this problem or this theorem. Then, that being a brief part of your classroom or related activity, if you're in a typical U.S. secondary school, you go through the literally anal process of detailing a proof, detailed logical argument. Now, in this process, there are two phases. In the first phase, in getting at the solution concept, you access self-consciousness and get what you might regard as an intuition of a solution. You play with this intuition until you are virtually certain that, at least as a hypothesis, this is a satisfactory solution. Then you turn your mind off and you get down to writing out the proof. There is no reflection in what you do for your grade in that class. There is no reflection of actual human mental activity, because you do not reflect in what you write. You do not reflect the fact that you actually accessed your powers of reason and developed an intuition of a solution concept. What you report is simply the anal process of detailing this logical proof, something which is done in the ego state. Well, I'll go to that German thing. We had a problem in Germany, among our members there, that we found that we have a significant number of members who are medical students. It's a fluke which one of the individuals here is partly responsible for. And we found that as they had to take their examinations, they would take off for 6 to 3 months to prepare for an examination. Didn't make sense, not to me. Then we found that after having the examination, that the individual was in a poorer state of mind, in poor emotional health, exhibited more acute neurotic symptoms, was less able to think than before taking the examination. Well, I was curious as to what had happened, and I found out when I got to Germany and dug into it with them. We did some sessions and found out the horrible things it had done to them. Now, the first thing about this 3 to 6 month period was that during this period of 3 to 6 months, the people taking the examinations, that is, absenting themselves from politics and actually all other kinds of intellectual activity, had plenty of time to whore about and perform what would normally pass for students' recreations. But they were, precisely, all of their recreations were of the most banal and degraded sort. There was no real intellectual recreation, really bestialized forms of recreation. A number of them who went through this tried to do political work during the period that they were preparing for the examinations and found they could not prepare for the examinations. What was the reason for this? When you look at the content of the preparation for a German medical examination, it may not be much better here. I just know the case in Germany. I don't know the case in the United States. It's strictly drill. It's a more extreme version of the same kind of problem which you run into in preparing the geometry proofs in the secondary school in the United States. Now, the mind will not tolerate the kind of memory drill required to prepare for such an examination if your self-consciousness is turned on. It's too degrading. So what the student was doing in absenting himself from political work, and it wasn't just political work, it was any kind of intellectually stimulating activity. The student had to cut himself off from all intellectually stimulating activity and reduce his life to merely grinding and drilling in memory for this medical examination, and otherwise keep himself on a fairly bestialized level in his social life and recreations. Then, of course, would come the end of this preparation process and go into a room, generally buy a suit for the occasion, and go into a parlor-like room, a dozen or so or a half dozen of them, sit around with 1 or 2 examiners. 2 or 3 questions would be thrown at them out of the hundreds for which they had prepared themselves. And then the student would leave the room and would generally have a real letdown and begin to manifest rather acute neurotic symptoms, as well as a general inability to do intellectual work. Well, we got into the depths of some of this stuff, and in effect, if you begin pulling up, and I'll get into this later, if you begin pulling up in analysis what had happened to these people, on the unconscious level, the effect was as if a large, more than slightly man-sized black beetle had performed sodomic rape on them. In other words, there was an acute sense of degradation in going through this kind of experience. And then, as we got into this with some of the physicians and medical students who'd gone through this process, we located a relationship between what is done to medical students in Germany and the sadomasochistic relationship among doctor, nurse, and patient in the hospital.